saw two people.
Well, welcome everyone. Before we get started, I might just ask you all to mute your microphones, just to eliminate any background noise. Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Button. I'm CEO of Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia, and I'm very delighted to see so many people turning up to this conversation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all coming in from today. In my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation down here in Melbourne. And feel free to acknowledge where you're coming from in the chat box. Just a few notes of housekeeping. We are recording this session so that we can share it with others who are unable to make today's meeting. As I mentioned before, it'd be great if people can keep themselves on mute unless they're planning to speak to the group. And we encourage you to use the chat function to record questions as we go, as things pop into your mind that you want to have responses to. Pop them in the chat and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. During that part of the session as well, please feel free to use the hand raise signal to indicate that you'd like to raise a question or make a comment. And I guess just more generally, the focus of today's discussion is really to introduce this whole concept to you all at a reasonably sort of high level. So it's not so much about troubleshooting any questions particular to a particular individual or group. It's more about what is this thing in general and how does it work. So without further ado, I'll spend a few minutes just introducing our organisation and sort of how we have come to be in this space and the overall idea behind Work and Welcome. We'll then hear from Gemma Bailey, the CEO of Talent Beyond Boundaries, and then we've got a panel of experts who have experience in using this pathway in the past, who are going to share with us what that experience has been like. And I would like to just ask for your forgiveness. I'm rather jet lagged and struggling with words a bit, so hopefully I'll muddle through, but please bear with me. If you could go to the next slide, Vivian. So for those of you who don't know our organisation, most of you do, but we're an independent national charity. We're focused on harnessing the goodwill, generosity and social capital of everyday Australians to benefit refugee newcomers, and we do that through this concept of community sponsorship. We have been thought leaders and advocates for new pathways and modes of settlement support that involve the Australian community, and at the moment we're partnering with the Commonwealth Government in the delivery of the Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, known by the acronym CRISP, which happily will continue on into the future as a permanent part of Australia's humanitarian program. And I thank all of you who've been involved in the CRISP so far in helping achieve that outcome. Through the CRISP, we've seen more than 900 refugee newcomers from 20 different countries, matched with community supporter groups in every state and territory in Australia. And we've got more than 1,500 Australian community members from very diverse backgrounds and locations involved in the work so far. So it's been, a great success so far, and we see the CRISP as really a solid foothold on which to build other forms of community sponsorship in Australia going forward. And this initiative that we're talking about today is one example of that. If you could go to the next slide, please. Just a crash course in what is community sponsorship for those who don't know about the concept. As practiced in Australia and in many different parts around the world, it's really this idea of a group of people who live in a particular location being mobilised, screened, trained and supported to work with a refugee newcomer or a family to support their migration, as well as to provide welcome and support to them post-arrival. Usually there's a fundraising element to cover some of the costs of that person's migration and for things like initial on-arrival needs. But probably the biggest part of the endeavour is that practical welcome and provision of wraparound holistic settlement and integration support. If you go to the next slide, please. So what is this concept that we're talking about today? We're calling it Work and Welcome. It's a collaboration between Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia and our good friends at Talent Beyond Boundaries. The idea at its core is about combining an employer-sponsored pathway for refugees arriving in Australia that Talent Beyond Boundaries has been developing and leading for a number of years, with the community sponsorship model of settlement support, bringing those two things together. And I'll explain the why of that in a minute. But just to talk a little bit more about the background to this, we tested this model in, I would say, ad hoc ways as an organisation back in 2021, 22, around that time, when we had lots of people arriving through the Afghan crisis, and in other contexts. We saw about half a dozen groups supporting arrivals through the Talent Beyond Boundaries labour pathway during that time. But it wasn't done with any degree of intentionality, and we're really looking to do it in a more intentional way at a slightly larger scale, and document the process, as well as ironing out any points of friction in the process in order to see it working even better in the future. I note that there's a published case study about some of that work that was done a few years ago. There's a link in the slide there with Animalogic as the employer involved in that case, and a really lovely story about how it all worked at that point in time. And I believe that we have some people involved in that case study as part of our panel later today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So why are we doing this? There's a number of different whys depending on the organisation and the different pathways, and I've tried to capture those all in summary. Obviously, we're all motivated to secure outcomes for refugees who so desperately need pathways to safety in this messed up world that we live in, as well as employers who need workers. So we're looking to secure outcomes for both refugees and employers, using this as a complementary pathway to traditional resettlement. The second why is that we want to document and support work that's already happening in the community. And a number of you have already started to connect the dots yourselves between the labour pathway and the community sponsorship model. We want to support that, document it, evaluate it, so that we can essentially encourage others to do the same in the future, as well as I said before, ironing out any issues of process to help that happen more smoothly into the future. We, CRESA, also really want to see the labour pathway scale to its maximum extent and become a permanent feature of the Australian landscape. And so we're very keen to work with our friends at Talent Beyond Boundaries to build on the excellent work that they've done so far. We also want to show the power and flexibility of community sponsorship. The CRISP is a great program and we want to see that thrive, but it's really one expression of community sponsorship, and there's a number of other forms of, number of other ways in which community sponsorship can really offer pathways for refugees, as well as provide strong settlement support on arrival. This work has the collateral benefit, I would say, of also having great potential to maintain and build public support for refugee migration. And I note the 5 C's of that underpin public support for refugee migration. This is building on the work of an organisation called More in Common, who have done a lot of public opinion polling research in places like the US, the UK, in Europe, where migration is an even more thorny topic than it is now. And what they've found is that public support for refugee migration and migration more generally relies on these 5 core concepts of control, compassion, contribution, competence, and community. I don't really have time to unpack all of those, but you might, for those who are interested in the conceptual underpinnings, have a look at that, at their work. You can Google it and find it quite readily. But I think it's fair to say that programs that highlight the contributions that refugees make to Australian society, and the fact that refugees come with skills and aptitudes and enormous potential, can only be advantageous to our mission of both expanding and improving opportunities for refugees in Australia. And I guess the final thing is to flag that we are at a time of great global challenge in relation to the refugee movement. There's an unprecedented number of people seeking safety in the world at a time when there's also shrinkage of traditional resettlement. And so basically we need all the tools that we can muster to continue to find opportunities for refugees and durable solutions for them. So there's a lot of global interest in these sorts of pathways. I've just come back from a global gathering where I heard about what Italy's doing in this space. They have 3 different programs involving the intersection of work and community sponsorship, and there's many other countries exploring this as well. So it's really part of a global movement and endeavour. That's it for me. I'm now going to invite Gemma to introduce Talent Beyond Boundaries and tell us a bit more about this really innovative pathway that they've developed.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lisa and Viv and all the team at CRESA. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining today and taking the time. I'm really excited about this conversation. As Lisa said, CRESA and TBB have worked closely together for many years towards the same goals. And so I'm really excited to be diving more deeply into this work with CRESA. And as Lisa said, to be more kind of intentionally testing this model, and by doing so, strengthening the impact of both of our organisations. So I know some of you are very familiar with this pathway and the concept of refugee labour mobility, but to some of you, it's also quite new. So I'll just take a bit of time. We've got, an hour and a half for the session today, but I won't take all of that time, but I will take a bit of time to kind of step through the purpose of the pilot and how it works. So our mission at Talent Beyond Boundaries, or TBB, is to open up skilled migration for refugees and displaced people, and to help them connect directly with employers so that they can migrate safely for work and rebuild their lives in Australia. Building on what Lisa said, it's a complementary pathway in the same way that CRESA is a complementary pathway to try to grow the number of refugees finding safety. But our pathway sits in the skilled migration stream, not in the humanitarian stream. And so taking a step back and just briefly speaking to that bigger context, as you know, and as we've just said, we're at this real high watermark in history in terms of the number of people who've been forcibly displaced around the world. Almost half of those are of working age, but they're largely stuck essentially in limbo in host countries, where most often they don't have basic rights, including the right to work and to pursue their careers. But then at the same time in Australia, we have employers who are facing acute skills shortages, crying out for talent across a range of sectors. And so at TBB, kind of our role and what we try to do is to really help bridge the gap between these two, and to make this immense pool of untapped talent in refugee communities visible and accessible to employers in Australia who are looking for skilled workers. So the kind of basic premise is thousands of people move every year for skilled migration. Why can't refugees? And so what does it look like in practice? Thanks, Viv. Just as an example. So this is Andrew Walsh here, former CEO of Iris, a really large fintech company, standing with Tarek Mullah. Tarek is a software engineer from Syria, highly skilled, was partway through his master's when conflict forced him to move to Jordan, where he lacked many rights, including the right to legally work. Through TBB, Tarek was linked with Iris, and Iris was looking for software engineers. They ran the same recruitment with Tarek as they would for any other local or international hire. He did, I think it was 2 interviews and a skills testing process. And at the end of that process, he was the strongest candidate standing of the cohort. And Iris went on to sponsor him through the pilot. He's now been in Melbourne for more than 4 years. He's been promoted into a senior role, and Iris has gone on to employ 5 people through Talent Beyond Boundaries. And Andrew's here kind of encapsulating the program, saying, what if by solving one problem, we can alleviate the other in terms of bridging those gaps? And so that's kind of the essence of what we try to do at TBB and how we pitch the program. So at TBB, we essentially do 3 things. Firstly, we're a systems change organisation, much like CRESA as well. We work with the government to identify and overcome the barriers that refugees face in accessing skilled migration. So until now, displaced talent, as we call it, has essentially been locked out of normal skilled migration. It's really hard for a refugee to access normal skilled migration. This can be as simple as something as not having the correct documentation. If you're a refugee fleeing your country, you may not be carrying an updated passport or proof of your qualifications. And so through the pilot, TBB work with the government on a co-design process to kind of identify and systematically break down those barriers and open up. This is a new pathway to test and hopefully be made permanent. Secondly, we connect employers with skilled refugees. So we kind of act like a bit of a kind of quasi-recruitment agency in that respect, and that we work directly with employers to understand their needs, to shortlist candidates and to support recruitment. And on the other side of the coin, we're a global organisation, so we also help refugees overseas to remain competitive in the jobs market through support with their CVs or interview preparation, connecting with partners for training in English and in other skills. And then finally, we're working to grow refugee labour mobility and hopefully make it permanent. So through the pilot, we think we've got a proven model in Australia that we know works. We have employers who found the talent that they need. We have candidates who are now living safe and productive lives in Australia. And so our mission is to continue to grow that work and transition to a permanent program in the same incredible way CRESA has done. So, and it's why conversations like today are so important of how we can all work together and support that. Just to give a bit of an overview of where this sits globally, because we often have quite a few questions on this. As Lisa said, there's real kind of global momentum behind complementary pathways in general, but also behind refugee labour mobility as a kind of push to find a solution to the rise in displaced people. So to put the Australian program in context, Australia was really one of the pioneers in refugee labour mobility, and I want to acknowledge actually both sides of government and the department for their leadership on this over a number of years. The first candidates and employers globally to move through this pathway were in Australia. And so we now have active pilots in more than 7 countries. The kind of flagship countries are really the UK, Canada, and Australia, but we're increasingly opening up new pathways in Europe, unfortunately closing down a pathway in the US recently. But there's that real kind of global momentum. On the other side, sorry, I'll just go back to the map. Sorry, Viv. There's also been significant expansion in the countries that we're able to support refugees to migrate out of, because I know might be one of the questions that comes up. Initially, we had a very strong base in Jordan and Lebanon, working largely with Syrian and Palestinian refugees. Over the last 5 years, we've kind of expanded our footprint either through TBB staff in locations around the world or through local partners. So in Australia, the largest cohort of refugees who've migrated through the pilot are Afghans, followed by Syrians, Palestinians and Iranians, but we have also supported candidates globally in Latin America or in Africa. So it's kind of an expanding global footprint, but we do have different capacities in different places. So just to the next slide, Viv now, sorry. So the basis of our model, it's called the Talent Catalogue. It's a custom built piece of open source software that TBB created that kind of captures and documents the skills, the work experience, the qualifications of refugees. We say it's a bit like LinkedIn for refugees. So we invite candidates to enter their details, and then we use the software to match them with employers. So if you know of refugees and displaced people in your networks, please invite them to register. It's free of charge. There are simple instructions on the website and other support if they're having problems. And so we now have over 100, it's actually a bit higher than that now, over 130,000 refugees registered on our talent catalogue, and that number's growing by the day. And by analysing that data, we can see the incredible cross-section of skills that exist in refugee communities. Looking at the data, 44% of people registered in the talent catalogue have a tertiary degree, and about 3/4 speak English at an intermediate or higher level. So we've just pulled out 5 key sectors where we know there's demand. In Australia, we've seen really strong success in skilled trades and manufacturing. Over 60,000 people registered on the talent catalogue with that experience. Another area is health and allied health and aged care. We've seen some good success in Australia with over 18,000 people registered on the talent catalogue. And then again, strong pools in IT and engineering. But within those broader categories, there's obviously a range of occupations, from butchers to civil engineers to dairy farm workers to aged care workers. So the policy settings of the pilot allow for employers to sponsor over 900 occupations. So there are really generous occupation settings in place to allow for a range of occupations and skills within refugee communities. So looking to the pilot, you can see, if you just want to move it along, Viv, sorry, that diversity in the talent catalogue is reflected here in Australia with the employers that we have worked with. We've had over 160 employers make job offers through the pilot. And this is just a snapshot, but you can see kind of the range of employers and sectors involved. We've worked with employers across all states and territories, with the exception of the ACT. I think there might be some Tasmanians on the call at the moment as well, where we've just started to try to do more work. And we've had some strong buy-in for some really large and well-known employers, as you can see here, but also actually a large proportion of the employers recruiting through the pilot are small and medium employers. And a real kind of strength or trend, which may not be evident on this slide, is the kind of interest in regional Australia. About 35% of our candidates, or 40% of families, when you include the total number, have been sponsored by employers outside of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. And we're really keen to keep engaging with regional communities, regional employers, regional councils, to keep supporting that work. So in total, as I've said, we've had, if you want to just move it along, Viv, sorry, we've had over 160 employers make successful job offers through the pilot, and this includes employers returning for repeat recruitments. Over 350 people are in Australia right now, which includes family members living and working in communities, and another 100 are moving through the visa preparation and approval process. And we obviously track progress and stay in contact through regular calls and surveys, and we're seeing really positive settlement outcomes, strong retention rates for employers, which is fantastic, and stories of really welcoming local communities, which would not be a surprise to anyone on this call. So to the specifics of the pilot. So since July 2021, we've worked with the Australian government to implement, it's called the Skilled Refugee Labour Agreement Pilot. We co-designed this with the department. and have been doing this work, testing it really since earlier than 2021 as well. But we're now in the third phase of the current pilot. We have 500 places for primary applicants, so that doesn't include family members, allocated until 30 June next year, of which there are about 250 places left. So we've used up probably half of those. There's still, a really good amount left to go, and we'd really love to see those places allocated before 30 June. So the pilot essentially builds a series of concessions into an employer-sponsored labour agreement to address barriers that would usually stop refugees from accessing normal skilled migration pathways. And I know we've got David Wilden on the call, so any specific questions, I may be coming to you, David, but so examples of that is, a waiver of skills assessment. So the key is that the employer is satisfied through interviews and with testing that the candidate has skills, waivers of key documentation requirements. If a refugee doesn't have a passport, for example, or can't access a police check, there's flexibility around documentation that we can work with the department on. There's a higher age cutoff, which is in recognition of kind of lost career time that many refugees face when they're displaced. And as I said, access to over 900 occupations on the skills on a series of kind of skills shortages lists. So there are strong concessions that really help manage those barriers that refugees would usually face. Under the pilot, we have access to a number of different visa types, but we primarily it's called the subclass 186. And so what that does is give permanent residency, which is clearly very important for refugee and displaced people. They can't really be coming in on temporary visas, but it means they also have access to social security. They also have access to Medicare, schooling, and other supports. I'm just going to run through a couple of slides which are about eligibility. So it's particularly relevant if you're a CRESA group thinking of supporting job matching and outreach to employers or curious about the program in that regard. So the key is really that this is a skilled migration stream, so it needs to fit the requirements of skilled migration. Then you need to have a viable and active business who are looking to fill roles, permanent roles, and candidates who can demonstrate that they have the qualifications and work experience to match those roles. So on the candidate end, in terms of eligibility, TBB determines that through intake and interviews with candidates. They don't need to have a UNHCR RSD, like a refugee status determination, because as we all know, sometimes that can be difficult for refugees to access, but they do need to show that they're in need of international protection and without access to a permanent solution. And we've worked closely with UNHCR around how we do that intake process. They must have functional English, and that's just the primary applicant. So their spouse or dependents don't need that, but the worker does need that. And they have to hold the relevant skills and experience for the proposed role. On the employer side, the employer needs to be offering a 2-year full-time role with a possibility for extension at the required salary. So happy to talk more about TESMITs and minimum salaries, but there is a kind of minimum salary for the role. For lower skilled roles, we have a kind of 10% concession to bring it a bit lower, but obviously we want to be bringing people in, not undercutting Australian workers and being paid a wage that they can survive on. So that's actually a really important part of the program. Obviously, you have to be an Australian registered business with good standing and be operating for more than 12 months. You have to be the employer has to show they're financially viable so that they're not financially insolvent, obviously, and can support the candidate. And we judge that kind of based on a series of criteria, looking at their turnover, the profit of the business, the size of the business, and number of years in operation, the number of employees and what their organizational chart looks like. And then obviously the occupation and the genuineness of the role. So all of that piece goes into assessing essentially that it's an employer you know, who is financially viable, who needs skilled workers and can support those workers on arrival. And obviously they must show that there's no adverse information, so that you've not broken a law in any jurisdiction. We want to be working obviously with ethical employers who are going to be looking after their workers when they arrive. I'll move on to the next part. This is quite a busy slide, sorry, and we will be going through it a bit again with Viv after this, but just to kind of set it out for you, I think it's helpful for CSGs who might want to engage to really understand the process. So we're a trusted partner of the government in this work. We're the only implementing partner, and we aim to support kind of the end-to-end process with employers and with candidates. And in this case, with Work and Welcome alongside CRESA and the Community Support Group. So there's kind of two variations that I've tried to show here of how the process could work. The first and kind of most common one is the TBB facilitated stream. So generally step one is that an employer comes to us with a role they want to fill. We work with the employer to understand that role, any essential selection criteria and their timeline. And then we go back into the talent catalogue to identify if we have suitable candidates. And assuming we do, give them a short list of CVs to look through and decide if those candidates fit the employer's needs. If so, then we kind of help work with the employer and the candidate through the interview process, manage, you know, numerous IT issues that happens and timing issues that happen in that space. But we basically encourage employers to recruit in the same way as they would for any other international hire, through a series of interviews and skills and aptitude testing. And that's, you know, it's really important and vital, essential to the program, that interview process takes place. If the interview is successful and the candidate accepts, we then kind of move on to step 3 here. We work with the candidate, the employer and the lawyer on their application. And then once visa is approved, we then work with the employer to help prepare for the candidate's arrival and to support successful integration and settlement. And so this is a really, you know, this is really the meat of where CRESA and TBB will be working together on this project. So as candidates coming through the pilot come in as skilled migrants, not as refugees, they don't have access to the full suite of government provided settlement services. So we essentially work with employers to help them plan and coordinate that settlement step. And in the current pilot, that can look really different in each case. In some cases, we're working with large employers who have relocation policies and processes in place. It could be that we're working with an employer who contracts a settlement service agency, you know, SSI or Red Cross, on a fee-for-service basis to support settlement. Or this is where the Work and Welcome really comes into its own. We have a good number of employers, employees and community members that do want to step up and support settlement. So we kind of see that happening quite commonly in an informal way, you know, partly in this way that we've been testing with CRESA. The key is that the workplace is, from our end, that the workplace is ready, that the candidate has someone meeting them at the airport, they have temporary accommodation arrival, you know, local orientation, essential registrations, the things that I know that CSG groups, CRESA groups do so well. And then, you know, after that, step 5, we remain in contact with the employer and the candidate for at least 12 months post-arrival and do regular check-ins in a similar way that CRESA does with both sides to make sure the process is going well and that both the employer and the candidate are supported as they need. The variation on that is this kind of the second stream below, where it's employer facilitated or independently matched. So that's what we're increasingly seeing, is that an employer matches with a skilled refugee independent of TBB. That could be a candidate applying for a job through LinkedIn or Seek from overseas. It could be where a candidate connects through their own kind of professional networks, which is how a lot of us often get jobs, really, or where they connect through personal networks. So that could be where a community support group, for example, knows of an employer. And I know we'll hear from some of the groups later on who are doing some of that work directly with employers to try to engage them in the program. And so in those cases, the employer and the community support group will come to TBB with a job match in place. And then we'd move to working directly with the candidate and the employer for assessment and endorsement, visa application and onward. But we'll go into a bit more of that later on. And I imagine there will be quite a few questions about how that happens. Basically, we're almost at the final slide. Thank you. So we said the overall costs of hiring are broadly comparable to other international hires. It's not an inexpensive solution for employers, especially for small or medium employers who haven't done skilled migration before. But this is, one of the biggest barriers that we're facing in scaling is the cost. So this is just a broad brush outline of the key costs. There's obviously quite a bit of variation depending on the size of the family, the capacity and the English levels of the spouse and any dependent children. But as a baseline, the kind of key costs include, visa and immigration costs. So that's the cost of a lawyer to help support the work, the cost of the actual visa applications for the labour agreement, and the visa application, as well as the Skilling Australia Fund. Flights to support the candidates and their family to come to Australia, temporary accommodation. We, ask for at least 4 weeks temporary accommodation while the candidates find their feet. Settlement costs, and this is where, where it could be employers contracting settlement service agencies, or really excited about this model where we're partnering with community groups who really help provide that wraparound support. And then TBB has a facilitation fee when we don't get any money through the government. We're a charity like CRESA, and we're trying to work out how to become more financially sustainable as an organisation. So that helps us fund our work. So as I said, I know this will really be something that people on the call are interested in. It is one of the biggest barriers in scaling, is the cost of program to employers. We have wonderfully committed employers ready to make job offers, but just can't at a business level justify the costs, or where they might want to hire 5 or 6 workers, they're instead hiring 1 or 2. So we really see, the potential of this work to provide, fantastic supported welcomes, but also in helping to kind of bring down some of those costs so we can get more employers engaged and more skilled refugees into Australia. I'll leave it there for now. That's just the final slide is just a bit of our pitch to, to employers, but we've got quite a lot of materials which we can share with any CRESA groups who are interested in doing that kind of, in talking to employers in their own networks as well. But I'll hand back to you, Lisa or Viv. I'm not quite sure who's doing the next.
It's me. Great. Well, thanks, Gemma, for that great overview of the process. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm Vivian Chu. I work at CRESA as National Policy and Advocacy Advisor. What I'm going to do is just spend a couple more minutes walking through the processes and the criteria of the labour pathway, but really honing in on these through the lens of community sponsorship and the role of groups, and also the support that CRESA can provide in supporting groups that want to embark on this endeavour. I will say that it's really content heavy. There's a lot of information in these slides, but what we'll do is send you a copy of the slides after this, so don't worry about trying to write things down or take screenshots. We will send you the material to review and look through in your own time. And of course, you can then reach out to us if you have questions that come up after that. So what we've done here on this slide is to try and map out what it would look like, the different scenarios and ways in which you as community groups might be able to get involved in work and welcome. So obviously there's that green circle at the top, which is if you know any employers, please refer them to TBB. But then if you are connected with a potential candidate, so if there is a refugee candidate who meets the criteria that Gemma outlined earlier, so who qualifies for international protection. If you know of someone, then what you could do is essentially two things. One is to help them register with the talent catalog. And then what would happen was that the TBB facilitated job matching process would then kick in. So they're on TBB's radar, and they will then work to connect them with the employers that they're already have a relationship with. Additionally, or even concurrently, what you could do is then advocate with employers. So say you know someone overseas who meets the eligibility criteria and has experience working in aged care service provision. You might then try and engage aged care service providers here in Australia to say, look, here's this pathway, you may or may not be aware of it. I have a candidate I know overseas. Would you be interested in trying to hire them through this pathway? So that awareness raising and that advocacy. And I think that's really what we think the critical role that CSGs can play in helping to expand the pathway, as both Lisa and Gemma have spoken to already. And so then that would then sort of kick in either in an employer-led or independently matched process. And then what would happen, I think the role of the groups following that would really depend on what support is needed. That could include supporting the overseas candidate with relevant immigration processes, helping them kind of gather, collate the documents that they need, the evidence of their qualifications. And then, as also has been touched upon, for some employers, just the cost of the flights and visas can be a real barrier for engaging in this pathway. So groups could also support with fundraising as and when needed to encourage employers to come on board. So that's one. The other potential way of getting involved is, say you don't know someone overseas, but you are still interested in being part of that settlement journey for someone who has a job offer. And in those cases, what we would do is ask you to let us know about that, let us know that you are interested, and we would then work with you to match you with an employer and a refugee and their family who have that job offer and are going to be settled in your area. So that's the two sort of potential scenarios. And underpinning that would be that you would then work with us to form a community supporter group, undertake fundraising, mandatory training. We'll go through that in a bit more detail, but I think most of you will be familiar with that if you've been part of the CRISP. And through that, then continue to provide settlement support, which we would say would be up to 12 months. Again, many of these components will be familiar to you, so it would be that fundraising to support settlement, really providing that airport welcome, helping with temporary accommodation, essential registrations, and all the other things that really help refugee households to integrate and settle well here. So that's the sort of broad ways in which people can get involved. Gemma, I know you talked a little bit about the independently matched process. Maybe I'll just throw back to you to say if you wanted to talk in any more detail about what that looks like, because I think a lot of the people on this call will be interested in this particular element of the pathway.
Yeah, excellent. So the first step, obviously, so say that the job has been matched independently of TBB, and you come to us. For the employer, they need to put in an expression of interest through our website and attend one of our information sessions. And really key to us is that we're able to work directly with the employer, so that liaison can't happen through the CRISA group. It's an employer-led scheme. We need to know that they understand their obligations and that they're very committed to this role and it being a full-time role. So we need to get directly engaged with the employer. We do an initial assessment. We work with Fragment to do that. That's one of the costs, is to ensure, go through all of those documents that I said before, look at the financials, look at the organizational charts, come back to us and tell us it's a viable employer. We rely on that to make our to make our endorsement. We do one-on-one interviews with the employer. during which we'll talk through the settlement plan and the steps and the obligations of the employer. And then we endorse the application and it goes on to labour agreement and preparation. On the candidate side, similarly, the candidate registers their interest on our talent catalogue and they get a kind of unique ID. We do that intake process, so that's someone in our source team who interviews the candidate to understand their eligibility as well as their English language competency. And then, these processes are kind of working in parallel with each other. Once the job match has been agreed and the employer is assessed as being eligible, we then conduct what we call an IDM, or an informed decision-making session. So that's, again, an interview with the candidate, to make sure they understand the job application, that they're, where they're moving to in Australia, that they understand their rights and obligations under the program, and they're making an informed decision of their own. And then it goes down into labour agreement and visa preparation, where we'd be working with the employer's lawyers or migration agents. We have a kind of preferred immigration arrangement with Fragaman, who have been a really strong advocate of this pilot as well. We work very closely with them on cases that they're running, but we'll also work with other migration agents and employers if that's the employer's preference as well. Our requirement is that they have at least 3 years experience in skilled migration, just because labour agreements are kind of complicated, and we want to make sure we're working with lawyers and migration agents who understand that and can explain those obligations accurately to employers, and work on strong applications, in that it's a pilot phase and we want to make sure we have the strongest cases going forward. Viv, do you want to speak to the CSG?
Sure, yeah. And so for many of you on the call, I think these processes will be familiar. They very much mirror the processes that exist under the CRISP. So, roughly divided into 3 core stages, which is the registration of group members. So, we need a minimum of 5 adults. We need to appoint key roles within the group, so a group coordinator, a deputy coordinator, and then also just undergo all those sort of background checks, the working with children check and the national criminal history check. And then, we move into the sort of preparatory stage of the fundraising, developing a budget, showing that the budget has 50% of the budget has been raised, and then moving on to the settlement planning. So I think the stages within this really will depend case to case, like the sequencing of it. And one thing I didn't mention before was as we work on sort of testing this collaboration and the models of community sponsorship with Labour Pathways, it's really about, I think, building flexibility into the way we work, because different employers will have different capacities, and also groups will be different depending on where they're based and the industries that people are moving into. So we're keen to really just, develop a lot of flexibility into the way we work and to support each other through this sort of testing period. I will move on to the next slide. So this is really, again, the goal is to send this to you after the this online event so you can digest it properly. But we wanted to put this all into just one slide so you can look at the eligibility criteria across employers, refugee candidates, as well as groups. Gemma's already spoken about employers and refugee candidates, but with the groups, again, I think this will be very familiar to most people. I've spoken about the background checks and the requirement of a group of 5. CRISA runs a training program for all groups that are part of the CRISP, and it's a mandatory training program that everyone will need to undertake before they welcome. And what we would envisage would be the same sort of support, training and follow-up support that would be provided to groups that are involved in the labour pathway as well. I will go to the next slide. I'm going to just talk through how we envisage groups functioning and operating and what they would be comprised of. We've sort of set out 3 different scenarios. One is the employer-embedded one is the employer anchored and one is the independent model. So essentially with an employer embedded model, this could be a scenario where a community supporter group is comprised primarily of people from the employer. So say you have an employer who recruits through the pathway and says, actually, I want my employees to be involved in this process of welcome and settlement. And so they would have, say, if there were 5 group members, say 4 of them would be from the employer. We'd always encourage at least one, hence that little wheel spoke, being outside the circle, to be outside of the actual organization. An employer anchored model where there would be division, so some groups outside in the community and some within the employer, so a division of roles within the group. And then independent would be where groups just operate separately from the employer. I think all 3 are viable models, and we're keen to test all 3 throughout this project. But we do see the benefit of having an employer anchored model where you have some members of the employer involved and some members outside of the organization involved in being part of the group. But no matter what, I think even though all 3 models are viable, what will be really critical is just ensuring that there is really good communication between everybody who's involved. This is the last slide. So I think what will be really important is that communication, very clear lines of communication, delineation of responsibilities and roles, but also just collaboration, making sure that the community supporter group communicates effectively with the employer and the refugee household. I talked about flexibility in the model. We need to make sure that we are actually just meeting people where they at in this, and what employers can and can't provide. They will be large employers and then ones that are much smaller. And so I think it's about tailoring it to meet different requirements. The last 3 points on this, I think, are very familiar with people who are on this call. Really that need to trust and recognize the expertise and the independence of groups that are doing this work. And that's where, the knowledge lies. That's where, the knowledge of the local area, the local context, and really empowering groups to operate in that way. And having the relationship between the groups and the employer as well is really important. So I think I will wrap up the slides process there. You'll be relieved to know. I will stop screen sharing for the moment. If I can figure out how to do this, or perhaps not. Maybe what I'll do instead is actually just move to the segment where we're getting hearing from a number of people who have used this pathway. So we've got 2 groups on the line. We've got Emma Barry, who's from the North Sydney Friends of Refugees. Emma, are you here? If you could unmute.
Yeah, hi Vivian, I'm here.
Great. I'm going to just spotlight you. I'm sorry. And then if we have Sue Milne, who's from the and Marilyn Leitz from the Northern Rivers for Refugees. Are you here?
Yes, Vivian, I am. I'm under Alison Saunders' name.
Okay, perfect. Here you are. Great. There you are. So what we wanted to do was really just give you a chance to hear from people who have used or who are currently using the pathway, and to get them to share their experiences and some advice perhaps for others who want to embark on this process. So maybe we just start with you, Emma. If you could just outline really just quickly what your experience has been of supporting refugees or candidates, to move to Australia under this pathway.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vivian. So our group's been running for about 4 years now. We were originally a group mentoring program group under CRISA, and we decided not to go down the CRIS pathway, but we have now supported probably about 2 individuals ourselves in terms of that independent matching, but another 4 individuals or families who've come through TBB, but through that employer-led side of things. So we've sort of seen both pathways and provided support. But in terms of the specific individual that I'll speak about, we can just call him Mohammed. We were introduced to him and his wife through one of the women that we were supporting separately, who'd come through TBB, and he'd worked for an international NGO supporting girls and women. We were introduced in 2023. And now we were aware of the TBB program because of the support we provided to a number of those other women that had been employed by a large sort of media and arts company. And so what we did initially was we just spoke to him, explained a bit about TBB, helped him update his CV and cover letter, and then we did get him to register on the talent catalogue, but we also thought, why not just circulate an anonymised version of his CV with a cover letter sort of to our networks. And this really wasn't my plan, but when I sent it to my mum, she actually is my parents run a family business, and they had an opening because this individual, his background was in business and project management. And I said, there's no pressure or anything, but if you're interested, having seen his CV, and he had, done a really good job of maintaining kind of certifications in things like Prince and PMP, and they interviewed him, and were really happy to make a job offer for him. So we really went down that independent match pathway. Now, where our group came in is the sort of deal was that our group would do all the fundraising to cover the sort of $20,000-ish in cost, where it roughly landed for him and his wife, to cover everything from the TBB fees to all of the government fees, and for Fragaman as well. So we committed to raising those costs through the TBB kind of crowdfunding platform, and they were to meet their end of the bargain with the 2 years of employment and sort of meeting all of the terms of the pathway around salary. And so we met him in about 2023, and it's just been a year since he's been in Australia. So it kind of took a year altogether from when we first met him to when he arrived in Sydney.
Great, thanks, Emma. I might throw the same question to you, so Sue.
Yeah, sure. Hi. So I live in northern New South Wales in a small country town. I've been connected with the Northern Rivers for Refugees for a period of time. In 2016, I had some Afghan refugees come and stay for a holiday at my place. I stayed in contact with them in 2021 when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. One of them contacted me to say he was very concerned about friends of his in Kabul. They were Hazara, the persecuted minority. It was particularly the woman who had a professional background that made her very vulnerable. And he wanted me to do a humanitarian visa application for her. So I did. But then I stayed in contact with them, and I started to feel very connected to them and cared about them. And then in 23, this woman was actually detained by the Taliban for 20 days. I saw, when she was released, I saw the bruises on her body, and I suddenly felt that I had a very big responsibility on my shoulders to do something to get this couple to safety. I knew the humanitarian visa application was probably going to go absolutely nowhere. Concurrently, I was coordinating a community support group, a community sponsorship group for a family from Syria who were settled in our area. And I was having monthly contact with Kirsa, and I said, do you know any alternate pathway that I could get this couple to safety? And it was Renata who told me about the Talent Beyond Boundaries program. So I'd focused on the woman, so I said, does your husband have any particular skills? He was an accountant, an auditor, really highly trained accountant. So that was when I started on the Talent Beyond Boundaries program. So he registered on the talent register. I then approached the Committee of Northern Rivers for Refugees to say, this is going to be really expensive. And they, Marilyn said to me, the president said, don't worry about the money. So that was fantastic. And that's been an amazing thing to be able to offer the employer that eventually came forward, because there's no way he would have been able to afford those fees without that level of support. So I had that in place, and then it was just a matter of finding an accountancy job. And I wasn't looking in our local area. I was looking everywhere in Australia. I emailed the 4 big accounting firms. I looked in SEEK. I, spoke to a case manager in SEEK to see if they could help me. Any accountancy jobs that came up in our local area, if I'd ring. I hassled every single person that I met who had any accountancy connection. This was a year. It took, I think, for me, that was the hardest part of the process, is actually finding an employer who would be willing to take an Afghan refugee who was sitting in Iran into their company. I think that was very hard. Finally, someone said, why don't you go to the local Chamber of Commerce? You never know. So I went along one Friday night, and there just happened to be, from my local town, an accountant who'd been trying to fill a position for 12 months. And I talked to him about it. I thought his eyes were glazing over, actually. But he rang me the next day and said, oh, look, I am interested in following up. This is in February this year. So it has been a really long process. So he then interviewed this man twice. He got his office staff to have a meeting, a Zoom meeting with him. And very quickly, he offered a job. It's just been a process that everything that Gemma has outlined, we've been through that process. In April, when things were moving along, I decided, because I'd had such a positive experience of the community sponsorship model, I could see how it provided such a soft landing for the Syrian family that we worked with, and how we engaged so much local goodwill and expertise. And so I decided just to form my own little completely informal community support group. So we've been operating for about 6 months, and I'll talk to you later about how I think the amazing things that people have been able to do. So that's my experience. And we're still waiting for that visa to come through so that they can finally come to Australia.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, I think, well, you might just want to continue, because I think what we wanted to also hear from you about was what you think the benefits of just having a group involved. I mean, you've talked about that sort of perseverance in trying to find an employer, and that sort of advocacy with employers, which I really think is such a critical role that groups can play. And then that fundraising component for an employer who would just not have been able to embark on this process. But does anything else kind of jump to mind, and what you think that the strength of the group model could be?
Yes, so much. So I think our community support group is part of the accountant, the employer, and also the refugees to be community. It's their local community. And I've got a whole lot of examples, really, of how I think being part of the local community has enhanced our capacity to provide support to both the employer and to the refugees. So just quickly, in terms of the employer, I've had a relationship with him since February, supporting him through the bureaucratic process, keeping him updated. The other thing I should say is that Northern Rivers for Refugees were able to connect with a local immigration lawyer who has been beyond amazing. We're sitting in her office today actually doing this meeting, and she's been doing the work pro bono for us. So that's just another thing that we've been able to access. So with the employer, yes, we've helped him through the bureaucratic process. We've had a thank you morning tea to him and his office to thank you for their offer. I think they've been really comforted and they feel secure knowing that there is a support group that is going to help the refugees with the accommodation and the social support and the banking and all those things. I think that's contributed to him actually moving from feeling tentative about what he was offering to actually really engaging now and very committed. He's waited 12 months for this employee. And I kept crossing my fingers, hoping that he wouldn't back out. But he now sees it as a win-win for him to get an employee and, helping 2 people get to safety. So he's definitely committed. The other thing is that we've had in our community support group, we have a local accountant who actually works for Chartered Accountancy Australia and New Zealand. So she's been able to mentor the refugee in Iran. She's been able to support the employer. She's organised training for the refugees that he's been undertaking while he's been waiting. So he's been learning the software that the accountant uses. He's been learning about Australian tax. He's been, preparing for his work while he's waiting. And the other thing is that the Chartered Accountancy Australia New Zealand has offered to provide, apparently it's thousands of dollars worth of education to him when he arrives so that he can move over to being a chartered accountant in Australia. So, and just, it was interesting to hear you, Vivian, talk about the model where perhaps some of the staff of the employers would be involved in the community support group. They're actually not, but they are. They're also really engaged, and one of them has a husband who's very involved in the local soccer team. And I asked the refugee, was he interested in soccer? He loves playing soccer. So, you know, as soon as he arrives, you know, she's going to get her husband to join the local soccer club. Yes. Well, I keep going. I've got so many examples. So because of the lengthy process, we've had lots of time for community engagement with the little town. We had a community meeting during Refugee Week where lots of people came. So now, on top of the 9 people in the community support group, we have like more than 30 volunteers who wanting to help. You know, they want to help with transport or social support, or they're given money, or they want to do swimming lessons, or, you know, provide free haircuts. So we've got this base of additional support just waiting. And beyond that, you know, it's a small town, so word spread, basically. And I've had people just contact me spontaneously saying, I've got an Airbnb that I'm happy to give for free for 2 months when they first arrive, fully furnished. I've had someone saying, I've got rental accommodation that I'd really like to make available for them. So there's just so much now waiting for them. We've had a fantastic community activity in the local Anglican hall where some of the support group members who are sewers have brought in other locals, and they've sewn this beautiful welcome to Australia quilt, a banner that we're going to take to the airport when they finally get here. We've met with a local GP who we know is very compassionate, and she's happy to bulk bill. We had an offer from a local dentist to provide free dental care initially. The local psychiatrist is happy to give us a workshop for both the community support group and the employer and his office in trauma and the impact on refugees. Fundraising, you know, just let's keep going.
Is there something about the model in the regional areas of having a community supporting organisation such as Northern Rivers Refugees?
Like, do you want to make
Yeah, so it's, I'm sorry, we were just sort of chatting before, but it's Marilyn here. I just wanted to add that I think for a regional area, Northern Rivers Refugees is a community supporting organisation registered with CRISA, and I think that structure of being able to raise money and pass on information about some of the broader resources, not Sue's doing a magnificent job in their community, but I think that's an important part of the support to keep going. Like what Sue's described as a very, very long process not very long, but with that community outreach and getting profiles. So I just want to mention that, give recognition to that structure or framework that CRISP introduced. I think that's been quite effective for us, both under the CRISP program and then moving into TBB. Sort of has the different layers.
I could just give more and more examples, but I think you've got the general idea. But I think it's worth saying that whilst we're supporting the employer, we're also continuing to provide very active support for the refugees. They know that all this is happening. I think we've built up such a trust with them now, and they know that they're arriving to all this support. I think that's really helpful. Yes, I think that's all I want to say right now.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you both. I can see that there have also been a number of comments in the chat just about the need to write this up really and to inspire others to do this. I think You make a really important point about the length of the process. I think with many, immigration processes, visa processes, it will take time, and it's about often just trying to manage the expectations of the community, of the employers, and making sure that we're kind of preparing for that. But I loved just hearing how you've made use of that time to do all this mobilization work in the community and getting skills recognized or accredited, so that when the family arrives, they are ready to hit the ground running. And I think that's so good to hear. Emma, I'm going to just throw over to you as well to share your reflections on that question around the strength of the community sponsorship model.
Yeah, sure. And I think we've kind of now seen it through the two lenses, the one where kind of we've been really involved with that gentleman I spoke about and his wife, but also through the various women where we weren't involved in the facilitation, but kind of bridged a gap that maybe an SSI would have otherwise bridged. So I'll speak kind of more about the support we've provided through the process. So throughout the process, I think as the Northern Rivers Group spoke out, given it so long, like we were just in, almost daily or weekly contact with him over Signal, staying in touch, things were changing like rapidly on the ground in Kabul. But we also help fund things like their health and medical, and also their IELTS, which actually required us to pay for a visa for them to travel to Pakistan for him to sit that English exam. So there were kind of a lot of moving parts and, times when we were getting information, but also transferring money to Afghanistan through a hawala, which is an interesting experience if that's not something you've done before. A little bit scary when you're sending huge amounts of money to a, sort of unknown address in Afghanistan. And then we really focused on a lot of the fundraising and stayed in touch with the employer as well. So I kind of would follow up with Fragaman, also follow up with the employer and kind of keep everyone in the loop. In terms of fundraising, we did a lot of that through kind of our networks and contacts, but we also did a lot of Bunnings barbecues, and we also have a relationship with a wine distributor who we sell wine to family and friends, and we get a profit margin on every bottle sold. So they were just some of the things we did to raise funds. But yeah, then it all really started when they arrived at the airport. So we picked them up. He actually lived with my husband and I for a month. He came before his wife, so they really well and truly got that experience of kind of understanding each other's cultures. There's some interesting quirks in terms of how Australian and Afghans think about concepts like time and timeliness, and just different life routines, the food we eat, all those kind of things. But from that first day, we were down in North Sydney opening a bank account at the Westpac, getting a SIM card, registering with Medicare, and then it all started. Actually, the rental application started really quickly. He really wanted to find himself a place for in time for him starting work. So we did dozens of rental visits, and I would sit with him in the evening and we would write the rental application together. Just some of those things are new. But then it was also really small and specific things like where could you find a bulk billed medical centre on the North Shore, because most of them aren't. So connecting things with things like that, where to shop for Afghan food and going out to Maryland's, what to wear to work, and like where to shop for work clothes and things like that. And then when they moved, once he was able to secure accommodation, it was also things like using our networks, as the Northern Rivers Group have spoken about, just generosity around donations of crockery and cutlery and couches and beds and all of those types of things, and people being so generous once you tell the story. And I think at least what was different in our experience from the humanitarian was just that access to Medicare from day one, but also him knowing he'd have a steady stream of income. He started work about a week after he arrived in Australia, and that was quite intentional because he was really keen to kind of be on his own 2 feet. And then another thing that I think is really underestimated is the sort of social and emotional support. So we do a lot of social outings together. We actually bring together, for those who want to, all of the Afghan families that we've supported, and we do things like picnics, visits to the zoo, ferry rides, ice cream in Manly. So a lot of it's social, but they've we've hosted them at our house for meals. They host up at us at their house for Afghan meals. He's since had a baby here in Australia. So, you know, a lot of it's those small milestones. Some of the other members of our group witnessed the passport application for their daughter. So all of those really kind of important things that happen over the course of life. And yeah, we really just stay in touch regularly. And I think it's really nice a year on, you know, sort of his responsibilities at work continue to grow. And he's really kind of considered well and truly one of the team, and has just thrown himself at work completely. And you know, when I speak to my mum and dad who employ him, you know, he's just so loyal, so hardworking, really wants to make the best of this opportunity in Australia. And you know, I think that's really a win-win, both for him to have this guaranteed employment for 2 years, but also for the employer to have someone who just, you know, really is so grateful that they're able to kind of start a new life here in Australia. Not that, you know, that's also not easy, given that all of their family kind of remains back in Kabul as well. So I think there's a lot of, you know, I hate to use the word guilt, but nothing else comes to mind. But, you know, there are those kind of challenges that come with being members of a family who can leave a place like Afghanistan, but leaving behind such a large family and never knowing when you'll see them again, if at all, which I know weighs on them. So that social emotional support's really important.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, I was just reflecting on how I think, you know, when we engage employers, I just trying to picture myself being an employer and listening to the support that's provided and how comforting that would feel. I think, Sue, you did mention this point as well, just knowing that it's about taking the step to offer a role, but knowing that there is just this whole community that will be there to provide that sort of support, practical and emotional and social support too. Look, I know we're quickly approaching 2:30, and I realize that we haven't quite, and we've had a few questions come through the chat actually, but I wanted to also just give space to anyone who might want to ask a question of anyone who's spoken today. If you do, either use the chat or put your hand up and we will come to you. Lindsay, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Hi, this is just a question for Gemma. Is it an advantage to you, if I was wanting to do this thing, to do it by way of a CRESA group? I speak as someone who's had a group. It was quite hard work, and I'm just not sure that the people I would want to involve in my group would want to go through the whole CRESA process. But I just wondered, is it useful for you to have, you know, as many of these as possible going through CRESA?
I mean, I think, thanks so much, Lindsay. I think the support that CRESA can provide, you know, community, because those community groups setting up will be really invaluable. So we have a lot of, like, quite a few arrangements where communities have just formed around welcoming candidates and supporting employers that look a bit like CRESA groups. But I really think if those groups have the support and the infrastructure of CRESA behind them, you know, that's an incredibly valuable thing. As well, it's useful because we're trying to do this demonstration project as a bit of an example to the government, as well as part of our advocacy work. So I think being able to test those few different cases, test what works, make sure our kind of communication lines are clear, that our expectations are clear. I think there's real value in that as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. Anyone else have any other questions, comments?
I think Alison's waving her hand.
Oh, Alison.
Sorry, I'm having difficulty finding the hand raise on the computer. As Gemma and Vivian know, we, as of Friday, found an employer, and this employer is potentially for more than the refugee that we're trying to get employed. And in fact, they're after something like 300 employees, just saying. But the process now, I've just literally, while we're having this meeting, had an email from them saying before they engage with TBB, they want to discuss the visa requirements, which they did try to discuss with me on Friday, and that's not my huge area of expertise. So is it best that they contact TBB direct, or and the Tas Refugee Legal Service have offered to do the legal work pro bono for this case. So should they work through them or through TBB at this very point?
Yeah, so we've worked really well with the Tas Refugee Legal Service on the on a candidate who's going through the approval process at the moment, possibly has just been approved recently, actually. So really have good lines of communication with them set up, which is great. I think the next best step, and it's such wonderful news, and they are, you know, such a, it feels like there's so much potential in that relationship. Yes, we're happy to meet with them one-on-one and talk them through it. And then I think and I think this is where each case might look a bit different. If you want to be a part of that conversation, that can be a three-way conversation. That might be helpful because they may have some questions about the settlement aspect as well, or we can do that one-on-one with them.
Yeah.
So
I think the biggest issue, sorry, I don't want to hog the time, but I think the biggest issue for them is the differential in cost for different visas. And they're used to the normal skilled migration process, which is a 482, I think.
yeah, we get this quite often. So employers only want to bring people over on temporary visas, not on permanent visas. And the permanent program is a bit more expensive for one, and two, they're nervous that they're going to leave. They're not, which is a really important safeguarding feature that our, you know, that refugees aren't tied to their employer. But from an employer's perspective, they are concerned about that. But I think with the Huon Refugees Support Group, if you can raise the funds that will help manage what would be a larger cost for them, I think that's how we'd manage that conversation. And secondly, you know, as Emma spoke to before, like we do have incredibly high, much higher than industry level kind of retention and employment rates, because generally if people arrive and they've start work within a few weeks and they feel supported, they feel very loyal to their employers. And what the majority of cases, we see people staying, and not only staying, but being promoted. So I think it's about, you know, working through those questions, but often employers do have questions around wanting to bring in temporary visas instead, and the cost. But I think that's where the CRESA model is actually like a really key part of success and scaling. Because if
I mean, I've explained to them that we would pay the differential in cost, but I think I'm just a volunteer to them, if you know what I mean. I don't have that kind of backing as Thank you.
Yeah, so really happy to have those conversations and really
and nut those things out. Thank you.
And echo Sue's points as well, and yours. The employer outreach is not easy. Like it's a lot of work to get employers over the line. So I don't want to.
I'm very excited so far.
Thanks, Alison. Susan, you had your hand up. You're on mute at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Is it better? My situation is probably different from others because I'm a co-proposer of a family. So the proposer and I are committed to the payments of the airfares, the family will settle with us. The spouse of the main visa applicant is an accountant. I was just wondering if you could advise whether we can fit into our family, with our support, of course, can fit into this program. Can they register, for example, with the TBB?
Yes, but are they already coming? I might call on Jay here, who is on the call somewhere, who is our wonderful seconded in-house lawyer. Jay, do you?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Do you mind to just ask again? Sorry.
We're family proposers rather than community proposers. So we take the responsibility of the payment. So the employer wouldn't have to make any payment at all. But so we're wondering whether we can match the spouse of the main applicant, who is an accountant, with an employer in this program.
When you say fees, are you saying the visa, the immigration cost, the cost of the program?
Yeah, it's the Global Special Humanitarian Visa Subclass 202. They haven't had their visa application approved yet, so we're doing what the groups are doing, some of the groups are doing, trying to get as much support for the visa as possible so they can have it approved and so they can get work here if possible.
There is a part of the course that must be paid by the employer. The rest of them can be paid by supporters. It's fine. The only part is the SAF, which is Skill Australian funding, the Skill Australian Fund levy, which is but that part of fee depends on the turnover of a particular employer. If the employer's turnover is above 10 million Australian dollar, that will be 5,000 Australian dollar that must be paid by the employer. So that means the fee must come out from the employer's account. Instead, you cannot. They cannot be covered by anyone else. It's by law. If the turnover is less than 10 million, that will be 3,000 Australian dollars for the SAF levy. The rest, of course, include the immigration visa application fees and your lawyer's fees that can be paid by supporters.
Okay, thank
Really
you.
happy, Susan. I've just put my email in the message list. Happy to have that conversation 101 because I think there's kind of two visa pathways going on there. There's the your sponsorship that you're doing, and then the possibility of using the pilot for a spouse. So happy to have that.
Oh, wonderful.
Happy to have that conversation 101 with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a bit to tease out.
Thank you. I know we're really running out of time. I think we've got about 3 minutes left. I wondered, for the person who has your hand up, I can't see your name, but if it was a question about an individual case or technical questions about the program, I wonder if that's something that could be taken offline. But if it was a broader comment, we'd love to hear from you.
You're on mute.
You're on mute. Sorry, we can't hear you. There you go.
Sorry, I'm an individual proposer like the previous speaker, and it's quite an involved question. So maybe I can email you.
Yeah, please do. I just put my my email in the
And who am I emailing that to?
You can just email it to me direct. J Bailey at Talent Beyond Boundaries.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to pop this screen up. Can everybody see the slide? Is that there? No. Okay, while I do that, I wanted to, Nicole's put something in the chat, which I just also wanted to draw your attention to. We haven't been able to hear from a refugee candidate who's been through the pathway for today's session. But we did have an amazing speaker come to our webinar that we held earlier this year for Refugee Week. And she, Fatima Rizai, who actually came through the TBB pathway and worked with Animal Logic, she's shared her perspectives of how important that support was to her to have a community supportive group involved. So I'd encourage you to go and listen to that. And Nicole's popped the link in the chat. Just in the last minute, in terms of next steps, what we thought would be wonderful and very helpful for both CRESA and TBB would be Nicole's popping the link to a very short survey in the chat. And if you could just complete that, so we have a sense of what the interest levels are amongst the people who are here today and your motivations for potentially continuing to work with us on this initiative. If you could complete that, that would be very helpful. And we will, after this event, also send out slides with more information on these processes. So keep an lookout for that email from us. And obviously just spread the word to any others that couldn't be here today, but who might be interested, as well as, especially if you have connections with employers who might be interested in using this pathway, please let us know. Gemma, Lisa, I don't know if you had any final points you wanted to make?
Nothing from me other than just thank you all for your interest and your support with this work, and hopefully we can see more of these collaborations get off the ground and support both refugees and employers.
Thanks, Lisa. Anything from you, Gemma?
No, just likewise. Thanks so much for everyone taking the time today. Really excited about how we can, work together to grow the impact of both of the pilots. Yeah, really open to people to contact TBB separately to find out some more information as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much to Emma and to Sue for sharing all your experiences with us today. And thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.